16 signs from this one chapter telling us that the return of the Lord Jesus Christ is near. Now, we're all familiar with signs, aren't we? There's a sign, Land's End, 874 miles. In other words, we're at north of Scotland there. It's a long way away. Supposing we see that sign, we're almost there, just 4 miles. And the signs that we're looking at are not signs that speak about distance, but signs that speak about time. As we've said, these are signs telling us that Jesus will soon be back in the earth. Now, just to set the scene, at the turn of the 20th century, there were no signs in this chapter speaking about the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. If we go to the 1980s, there were about 8 signs. Now, 16 signs. And that in itself tells us, does it not, that the day is getting nearer. The signs are getting more and more. They're getting clearer. Now, just before we look at these signs, I want to show that the verses that we've just read relate to the nation of Russia. Right. 6 ways to identify this chapter speaks about the nation of Russia. We read in verse 3, didn't we? Thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog. And Gog simply means an exalted leader, a mountain, someone who is in control. So when we read about Gog, Gog is the leader of this group of nations. The Authorized Version says he is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, many versions render that phrase like that. Prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. We've listed about 6 or 7 versions that translate it that way. What the Authorized Version has done is taken the Hebrew word Rosh and given us the meaning of it, chief. But Rosh is a word that identifies Russia to us. If we go to the historians, there's Bocart in 1640. He says Ross or Rosh is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of Russia. Or we could go to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Rus, also spelled Ross, ancient people who gave their names to the lands of Russia and Belarus. So there's one way in which we can identify that this is speaking about Russia. And you might think, well, that's a bit flimsy evidence, really, isn't it? And it is taken on its own, but that's just one form of identification. Verse 2 says, Gog, the land of Magog, or as some translations say, Gog of the land of Magog. So, back to the historians again. First of all, Josephus, a Jewish historian, he identified Magog as the Scythians of the far north. Or the Latin father Jerome, he says it speaks about Scythian nations, fierce and innumerable, who live beyond the Caucasus, and to give it its modern name, the Black Sea and near the Caspian Sea. Now, there's a map of that area, a modern map, highlighted the Caucasus, and what the historian is saying is they live beyond the Caucasus, to the north of the Caucasus, from Israel, that is. And it takes us to Russia once again, does it not? So that's just another identification. So who were these Scythians? Back to Britannica again. a nomadic people who migrated westward from Central Asia to southern Russia and Ukraine in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. And that's interesting because that was roughly about the time that Ezekiel was prophesying. He prophesied around about 600 BC. In fact, history tells us that some 60 or 70 years before Ezekiel prophesied these things, the Scythians did attack the Middle East. So the prophet's contemporaries would think, are they coming back again? But as we shall see as we read through the prophecy, he's talking about the latter days, and we'll come to that in a moment. Now, the historian who's known as the father of history, Herodotus, he tells us that two of the rivers of Scythia, to give them their modern names again, are the Danube and the Don. And we've put them on the map there. So what we can see is that this area of Scythia occupied a large area. There's Magog, and we'll come back to that later on because it's quite interesting. What about Meshech? Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Here we've got a comment from Gesenius, and all of these things we could spend a lot more time, but we don't have time to do it. We're just skimming through them, really. Gesenius says, a barbarous people inhabiting the Moscow Mountains between Iberia, Colchis, and Armenia. And we can see from the map there, we are in southern Russia once again. Identifier number 3. Meshech and Tubal. There's a map of modern Russia showing the rivers in the western part of the country. And we can just see the arrow there. It's pointing to the river Tobol. And on that river, we've got the city of Tobolsk. And most likely, we've got a link here once again. What we're saying is, when the prophet speaks about Tubal, he's most likely speaking about Tobol, the river Tobol, that area, or the city of Tobolsk. Identifier number 4. Thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts. If we move north from Israel, we end up almost directly in Moscow, capital of Russia. We know that some versions of the Bible translate it that way. Thou shalt come from thy place out of the uttermost parts of the north. So there we've got another idea, and we put all these ideas together, and it becomes quite clear, does it not, that yes, this chapter is speaking about Russia. There's another one, which once again, if we had time, we could go into in a bit more detail. But there we see Mr. Putin. Look above his head at that symbol that modern Russia uses. It's the symbol of the double-headed eagle, which of course is the same symbol that the old Eastern Roman Empire used to use. And if we had time, we could show how the prophecies link Russia with the old Eastern Roman Empire. And that's just one of them, showing that symbol there. But let's move on. As we've already said, this chapter foretells that a group of nations headed by Russia will invade Israel before the return of Jesus Christ. So let's look at some of the signs now. We read in verse 8, after many days thou shalt be visited in the latter years. And when the Bible talks about the latter years or the latter days, it's speaking about one or two epochs of time. Either the last days of Judah's commonwealth before it was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, or the last days or the latter days in which we live. We could call it the last days of human rule on the earth. We see it again in verse 16. I shall come against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days. So there it is again. What we're saying is, there's two signs to begin with. It's in the latter days, and it's against God's land, the land of Israel, that's gathered out of many people. And that's the subject, of course, of many other Bible prophecies, is it not? So we've got the first two signs. Verse 4, the prophet says, I will turn thee back. Just a few words. I will turn thee back. And the idea behind the phrase is to be turned back to something which originally existed. Comment here about Russia in 1917. The chief nation of the USSR was once considered to be among the most Christian nations in the world. Yet within less than a year after March 1917, when the last Tsar abdicated, a band of militant atheists had seized power. We read in the second paragraph there, how could the Bolsheviks, a small conspiratorial party, determined to smash the church and root out religion, take over the vast empire and turn it into the world's first atheist state? So in 1917 and thereabouts, Russia changed from being a Christian country to an atheist country. And now it's turning back. There we've got a couple of examples. We've got Mr. Putin and Kirill, who is the leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And there we see also Mr. Putin meeting the Pope. You see, Mr. Putin understands very well the importance of religion in controlling people and is using that to great effect. Now, this is just one way in which Russia has been turned back. There are other ways, but let's just concentrate on that one for the time being. In verse 7 it says, be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled. Those two words, company and assembled, come from the same Hebrew word, to assemble for religious and political reasons. So we're saying, here's sign number 3. Just 4 or 5 words, and it's happened. And these signs are not signs done in a corner somewhere. They're signs that we can see amongst the nations internationally, signs for everyone to see. Now, whilst we're still in that verse, I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws. We note it's hooks, plural. And here's one of them. You see, Russia has been pulled into the Middle East because of its interest in other nations around there. There's the first one, a growing alliance between Russia and Iran. There's another one, Syria. Syria-Russian relations built on trust. We read here in Sputnik, that's the Russian website. And Syria is right on the border of Israel, and we'll come back to that as well in a moment. Sign number 4. There are other hooks that we should look at later on. And then that verse says, I will bring thee out and all thine army. So Gog controls an army. There's the army. Just one example. The Washington Times says, Putin encircles Turkey in a massive troop build-up. And we read about Russia's troops on many occasions, and that's just one example again. And there we read that Mr. Putin has encircled Turkey in a classic pincer movement. Troops above, troops below. And that once again is interesting in the light of Bible prophecy. Sign number 5. Then it says, 3 words this time, be thou prepared. And we say, prepared for what? And if we just turn to another prophecy, the prophecy of Joel, just a few pages on from where we were in Ezekiel 38, we get this idea expanded for us a little bit. So if we can turn to Joel chapter 3, which is a parallel prophecy to the one that we're looking at, we can see that, for example, if we look at verse 1 of chapter 3, for behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. It's at the time when God brings the nation of Israel back to their ancient homeland. And verse 2 says, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And the prophet describes what's going to happen. But if we drop down to verse 9, we read there, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war. That's what the preparations are about. Prepare war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near, and let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears, and let the weak say, I am strong. So Joel there tells us what the preparations are all about. Ezekiel 38 says, you need to be prepared. Be thou prepared. There we see a graph of Russia's military expenditure from 1993 to 2013. It's a graph that climbs steeply with just one blip. There's a blip halfway up there. And that was when Putin was not in control of Russia, but Medvedev was. But once Putin was back in the driving seat, up goes the graph, and it continues to go up as well. It was in 2014 that Russia annexed Crimea. And one reason that Crimea was annexed was because of, well, that place that we've arrowed, Sevastopol. There's a Russian naval base at Sevastopol. See, the Russians leased it from the Ukraine, but now Russia, in effect, said, we're going to take that. And in the taking of it, of course, they took all the Ukraine ships that were there as well. So that's Sevastopol. There's another Russian naval base. This is the port of Tartus off the Syrian coast in the Mediterranean. If we on a map, what we're saying is we can see that Russia has a port in Tartus, a naval base. It's got one up there in Sevastopol. It's got an air base at Latakia. It's developing another one at Benghazi. We can see what's happening, can't we? You see, Russia is building up its military presence in the whole of this area. And then we read things like that from the Russian Navy. They intend to increase their presence. They're going to build another 10 battleships. This is over and above the battleships that they've got there already. Yes, indeed, they are preparing war, and particularly in the area of the Mediterranean. You see, that port of Tartus and the naval base of Latakia are literally just a few miles from Israel. I will put hooks in thy jaws. This is what the diplomat said back in 2015. Russia's military reforms have been misunderstood and its capabilities underestimated by the United States and Europe. That's the conclusion of a new report by the European Council on Foreign Relations. And so the rest of the world has been caught by surprise. They've been caught napping, as it were, not realizing the way in which Russia is building up its military presence all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East. And the two photographs at the bottom show us the Russian military on the move. The Zebka file, just a couple of weeks ago. Russia flies 2,000 mercenary troops into Syria. And once again, this is an extra 2,000 on top of the ones that are already there. Zebka file tells us that Russia is engaged in a major troop build-up. There's another one. In Syria this time, in order to solidify its military control of the country. The troops are stationed at Kenitra, which is just 5 kilometers from Israel's border, just across the border. So they're almost there in Israel. Another sign here. Spiegel Online International asked the question, why has Assad turned to Moscow for help? And we can't look at the whole of the reasons, but it's because he's frightened of his enemies. And that goes without saying. The Russians tell us there, our country will always protect you. That's its allies. Russia will always defend its compatriots from all forms of discrimination. Thou, a guard, the word means a protector to them. Here's an example, reported by BBC News in 2015 again. No US airstrikes in Syria since Russia deployed a new S-400 system, which BBC tells us is designed to protect critical infrastructure. And that shaded area on the map is where Russia controls the whole of that area, so that if any enemy flies any aeroplane into that area, A, Russia can see it, and B, if it so decides, it will destroy it. So there we've got Russia protecting that particular area. Go on to verse 5. We've got 3 nations mentioned here, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. And you know, one by one, all of those countries have moved, if we can put it this way, from the Western camp into the Russian camp. There we've got the Shah of Persia, as it was called in those days, on a state visit to America. Wikipedia tells us why the Shah was overthrown. Because it was beholden to a non-Muslim Western power, namely the United States. And the Shah lost the Shia clergy of Iran's support. Back to religion again, aren't we? Particularly due to his strong modernization principles, but also his recognition of Israel. The clergy of Iran didn't like, well, they hated, and they still do, they hate Israel. And so Persia has moved, as we've said, from the Western camp into the Russian camp. Sign number 8. We see Mr. Putin with the ex-president of Iran, Ahmadinejad. But note, he goes to see the clergy as well. Here we read that Mr. Putin warmly greets the new president of Iran, who was elected on June the 14th, 2013. When did he go to see him? Well, just 2 days later, on June the 16th, 2013. He didn't wait long, did he? It shows the close ties that there are between those two countries. About the next country, Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia in the Bible answers more to modern Sudan or part of Sudan, but it applies either way, whether we're looking at Sudan or Ethiopia as we know it. The same thing has happened. You see, that was the way that it was in the 80s. They were close to the West, to the United States of America. But then in 1991, everything had changed. And who are they with? Surprise, it's Russia. And there we see it was Medvedev that was in control of Russia at that time. Sign number 9. Libya, same story. But either as enemies of Italy, Libya is a natural ally of Britain and USA. That was in World War II. But what's the story now? They're moving towards the Russian camp again. We've seen, haven't we, that Russia is building a military air base in Libya. So there's sign number 10. And so the signs, as we said before, these are signs which everyone can see. International things that we're talking about here, aren't they? Until we come to the next sign, Brexit. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time again to look at this in detail, but the prophecy tells us that at the end, Britain will be against Gog when he comes against the mountains of Israel. And what happened in that vote was remarkable as far as students of Bible prophecy are concerned. We need to wait to see what happens here. For all we know, that we might go back into Europe, but we know that in the end, we are going to be part of a group of nations that oppose this invasion of Israel by Russia and its quickly. Tarshish in the Bible, we read, is an island or coastal nation, is a power with ships, is located to the west of Israel, it's a source of tin, lead and silver, a colonial power. It takes on the role of Tyre, a trading power, and particularly with the Gulf states. And we need to ask the question, if it's not Britain, what nation is it? And it's another of these ideas where if we put all the information together, it becomes quite compelling that Tarshish in the Bible, modern Tarshish, answers to Britain. Back to that map that we looked at before. You see, Scythia or Magog takes in not just Russia, but Germany as well. Gomer answers to France. But Tarshish is different. Tarshish is the power that opposes these nations, as we've said already. Here's a German magazine, Der Spiegel. Front cover, a tall, proud Mr. Putin. And just look down at the bottom of the magazine, and this is a German magazine. There we can see Angela Merkel with a white flag, the flag of surrender. She's waving a white flag to Mr. Putin. We read in that magazine, where do we stand when it comes to Russia? And relatedly, who are we as Germans? With the threat of a new East-West conflict, this question has regained prominence in Germany and may ultimately force us to reposition ourselves. So we've got another sign, have we not, showing that Jesus was simply back in the earth. We did hear that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel supports deeper economic cooperation with Russia, and she wants to get closer to Russia step by step. The way that she sees it is, well, we'll bring Russia into our camp, whereas prophecy tells us that it's the EU that's going into the Russian camp, really, and the Russians will be dominant in the end. Let's move to the Middle East. I'm back to the Middle East now. And this is the BBC saying speaking about a gulf which is opening up between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two big players in the Middle East. And they say, could open conflict now be one step closer between the two big regional powers in the Gulf? And there's the verse, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. So the merchants of Tarshish are with Sheba and Dedan, which speak of nations in the Gulf, really, in the Gulf area. So if we look at a map once again, we can see that what's happening here is exactly the same as the prophecy indicates, that some nations will be with Gog, principally Iran, but also Syria and Iraq and Sudan and so on, but others will be with the merchants of Tarshish, and that is exactly what is happening. What do we read here? This is Debka. This is just a couple of days ago. Israel's covert ties with Arab nations have reached unprecedented level, says Benjamin Netanyahu. So Israel is getting very friendly with some of the Arab nations, and it's the same one that Britain and America are getting friendly with as well. It's The Economist. With silver and lead, Britain woos new allies in the Gulf. And the quote at the bottom is Boris Yeltsin. He says Britain is back in the Gulf after a long period of being absent, 45 years. And he describes that absence as a mistake, actually. Britain should never have left in the first place. But they're getting very friendly. We read that so copious are the Gulf's investments in London that they called it the Eighth Emirate, says Boris Johnson. And what about this one? Potentially game-changing oil reserves discovered in Israel. After Israel complained for years it was surrounded by oil-rich states but didn't have a drop of its own, there's been a big-time turnaround. And this massive amount of oil has been described in the Golan, has been found in the Golan. As we say, they're close to the country's border with Syria. It all becomes very interesting, doesn't it? Sign number 14 is the spoil. And it's not just the oil, is it? Israel is becoming a very rich and prosperous nation. It's at the forefront of many technological things in the world. When we think of computers, for example, and the likes. Israel has the capital of the World Diamond Exchange. You would have thought that would have been somewhere where diamonds were mined, but no, it's in Israel. And Israel is becoming so important in the world after only being in existence for, what, 60, 70 years. We say here's sign number 14. Russia is going to come to take a spoil. Back to Mr. Putin again. This is the Washington Times reporting again. It says the Russian economy is in shambles and is expected to shrink again in the coming year. The problem is the collapse of crude oil on the international markets. The next step, the Washington Times says, to prevent social unrest could be military steps taken internationally by Russia. Now, I find that amazing because now this newspaper is saying it's a possibility that Russia could move internationally. It could go to war to take the spoil, which once again is exactly what the prophecy is telling us. At the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. And we say, well, is this another sign coming into focus? I've not numbered this amongst the 16. Possibly this is number 17. We need to see what happens here. But that's what the prophecy tells us. And this is what the Washington Times says is a possibility. Mr. Putin has got this problem on his doorstep. He's got to find money from somewhere. And how will he do it? By taking spoil. This is a comment by John Thomas back in 1848. He said, politicians speculate as though money were omnipotent, and we hear financial reformers predicting the inactivity of Russia and Austria for want of funds. Where did the barbarians procure funds for the overthrow of the Western Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries? Did they not support themselves by spoil? He says, let the Russian treasury be as empty as it's said to be, and its expenditure exceed its revenue by double the deficit, it will operate as a pressure from within. And we believe that this is what will happen. It will operate as a pressure from within to force Russia eventually, whether it's Mr. Putin or his successor, we don't know, but to, as John Thomas says here, enter into the countries and to overflow and pass over and wreck himself with the spoil of those he is destined to subdue. He's quoting there from Daniel chapter 11. Here's another interesting move. Russia and Israel have diplomatic and military ties as well. And we see in the picture there Mr. Putin and Mr. Netanyahu in discussion in Jerusalem, and not for the first time either. The prophecy says, thou shalt go and say, go to those that are at rest, that dwell safely. And we say, is this why Israel dwells safely? They've got the big boy on their side, or at least they think they've got the big boy on their side. They've got Russia. They're developing ties with Russia. And it's not just political. We've got a military cooperation deal. We don't have time to read all that, but the Russians are saying we can learn from the Israelis. They fought a lot of wars in the last few years and won them all. What they don't realise, of course, is that the God of Israel was with them. But there we see another sign, as it were, how that we've got these links between Russia and Israel, making Israel to think that they are safe. It's all human thinking, isn't it? And we know what the prophecy says ultimately. Verse 11 says, I will go to the land of unwalled villages, to them that are at rest and that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. And we say, this is not a sign yet, is it? And it led some to say, well, Jesus is not going to come back yet, but we need to be very careful. As we say, this could well happen after the saints have been taken away for judgment. And the prophecy of Zechariah tells us that when Jesus does rescue Israel, the saints will be with him. So we don't need to wait for that to happen, in other words. Slide number 16, the last one. And if we can turn back to Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel 38 and at verse 18. We read there, it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. And so Ezekiel goes on to describe a massive earthquake that will take place at this time. We read here that there's been about half a dozen major earthquakes in Jerusalem over the last 1,000 years, and that some Israeli scientists are saying there's another one likely within the next 50 years. Now, the Israeli government are taking this quite seriously. We read there, if a quake hits between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m., a whole generation would be lost, because they've discovered that all the primary schools are built on a fault line. Bit of a mistake, really, isn't it? But they're very worried about it. The mayor of Tiberias says, we are living on borrowed time. It could happen at any second. So here we've got Ezekiel, and also we've got other prophecies which speak about a massive earthquake that will take place at this time. And now we see that this is indeed a possibility. We say, well, there's sign number 16. And it's not just Israel. There we've got a map showing all the major fault lines in the world. And one of them we know runs up the middle of Israel, up the Jordan Valley. All men shall shake at my presence, Ezekiel says. We read this in Revelation. I come as a thief, says, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. And just 2 verses later on, we read that. There were voices and thunders and lightnings and a great earthquake, such as was not since men were on the face of the earth. So mighty an earthquake and so great, the biggest earthquake that's ever been known in the history of the world. And that earthquake, I believe, will be physical, it will be political, and it will be religious. This is the return of the Lord Jesus Christ to establish God's kingdom on the earth. Why the nations gathered? Why, the prophecy tells us. Thus, this is the last verse of Ezekiel 38. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself. I will be known in the eyes of many nations, says God, and they shall know that I am the Lord. And that's the end result of what we're reading in this chapter. Isaiah puts it this way. When thy judgments are in the earth, inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. You can't show favour to the wicked because he won't learn righteousness. And we know that that is true, do we not? It's only when God's judgments are in the earth. And those judgments are necessary to bring the nations to their senses, as it were. And it's Ezekiel that tells us once again, the work of righteousness shall be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness and assurance forever. So, just in conclusion, how can we survive the horrors of Armageddon? Jesus said, be ready. The Son of Man comes at an hour when you think not. He says in Revelation, I come as a thief. I'm going to come suddenly, says Jesus. We need to be ready, don't we? We need to watch. And what do we need to watch? We need to take heed to these warnings. We need to keep our eye on what's happening in the world. But not just that. We need to be aware of God's point of view at all times. And we need to separate ourselves from those things which are not pleasing to God. Because, as appointed a day, in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained. And he's given assurance to all men in that he's raised Jesus from the dead. May it be that when Jesus does appear in power and in glory, we may all be ready to welcome Jesus when he comes back. We might be watching and waiting so that when he does come back, we can be with him in that glorious kingdom. Thank you for listening.